Hello, everyone. Still roughly good morning. I should probably say good afternoon now in the UK and wherever you are tuning in from. So this session is the third session of the Green Book Fair. We're going to look at translation. We're going to look at how to approach a translation project as a publisher. We are joined by Honford stars Antony Birds, Nadia Saeed from English Pen, and Ra Page from Comma Press. Excellent to have you all. I want to introduce our panelists to begin. And so Ra Page is the CEO and founder of Comma Press. He's edited over 30 anthologies, which include the City Life Book of Manchester short stories, Penguin 1999. He probably doesn't want me listing them that far back. He's laughing now. But most recently, the Book of Manchester by Comma Press was published this year, so you should definitely check that one out. He has coordinated a number of publisher development initiatives, including Literature Northwest from 2004 to 2013, and the Northern Fiction Alliance, which I'm tuning in from, which was founded in 2016 and is ongoing. He's a former journalist, and he worked as a producer and director on many short films. He read physics and philosophy at Oxford and has an MA in English from the University of Manchester. Ra was recognised by the H100 Awards 2 years running for his contribution to the publishing and writing industry in the UK, and was included in the Bookseller 150 list in 2020, the annual guide to the book trade's most influential figures. A big part of what Comma does is translated literature. I'm really interested to see how this plays into the discussion and the various themes and series that Comma Press in Manchester run. We're also joined by Nadia Saeed, the Translation and International Officer at English Pen. So Nadia is the Translation and International Officer at human rights and literature charity, English Pen. She administers its various translation grants and co-edits Pen Transmissions, which is an international magazine for writers, where she hopes to celebrate young writers from the diaspora communities across the UK. She's based in Yorkshire and credits her previous work in publishing and theatre for her passion in bringing people together through writing and storytelling. And she received the Diana Awards for being an active campaigner of her work with Leeds Youth Council, and is a 2024 UK Creative Community Fellow. And lastly, but certainly not least, we are joined by Antony Bird, the CEO of Honford Star. So Antony is a co-founder of Honford Star, which is a publisher of translated fiction from East Asia. After completing an MA in publishing, he worked at various publishing houses in London before founding Honford Star. In 2022, Honford Star's title Cursed Bunny by Bora Chung, translated by Anton Her, was shortlisted for the International Booker Prize. And in 2023, Ninth Building by Zhu Jingzi, translated by Jeremy Chiang, was longlisted for the International Booker Prize. Amid the many responsibilities of running a publishing house, the true highlight for Antony is collaborating with talented translators, writers, and book designers from all around the world. What we hope to achieve in this translation panel is we're going to look at how to approach funding in an accessible way, and what kind of infrastructure you might need as an independent publisher to approach a translated project, and hopefully how to access money for it. So there will be chance for Q&A at the end, and I will have allow time for that. But to begin, I would like to start by asking Honford Star and Antony a question, which was, I wondered what for you were the key considerations when you're approaching a new translation project, especially at indie press level, which I know is quite different.
Yeah, so I think especially for indie presses, the biggest consideration is going to be the actual cost of translation. So I think if you're a publisher that has previously published English language original fiction, you might be surprised by the fact that there is this cost of translation that can be several times larger than the licensing cost. And yeah, so that's been the case for every book we've ever published. The translation cost has been larger than the licensing cost, and sometimes it's several times larger. So I think that's the biggest consideration, especially for indie presses. And another thing that that's important to remember is that there are some unexpected costs, I think, associated with publishing translations. So, for example, if you if you receive a manuscript from a translator that is several thousand words longer than you'd expected, it's not the situation where you can easily work with the translator to trim down that manuscript, because you'll receive pushback from the author and the original publisher, most likely. So quite often you are stuck with this larger than expected work, and there are costs associated with that, like the extra translation costs and print costs and editing costs. And if you are working with languages that are very different from English, so for example, like English, Korean, Chinese, and Japanese, then I think it is very possible that the final word count is very different from what you'd expected. So that's something that we've experienced in the past. That it wasn't too disastrous for us, but I think we have found out this previously. And finally, kind of an obvious point is that if you're working on translated books, then most likely your author is going to be not based in the UK. So if you want to do in-person events, then you're going to have to pay for flights and hotels and meals. So it gets really expensive really quickly. And there are some grants that can help with things like this. But if the grant pays for 70 or 80% of the total costs, then you are still paying for like 30 or 20% of a very large amount. So for an indie publisher, it is a large amount that you have to consider. And yeah, I think there are probably some other points, but they're the main ones that came to mind.
So it's almost that you have to be very good at your budget management if that translation does come back at longer than you budgeted for, I'm guessing.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's probably less of an issue if you're working with European languages. I think you're probably it's easier to predict the final word count, but yeah, so that does depend on the language you're working with.
That's good to know, because I'm sure people weren't quite aware of that between different languages. So thank you, Antony. I wanted to ask Ra at Comma Press, how do you think then that independent publishers can build this kind of necessary infrastructure to support these translation projects? That sounds like there's a lot of different things that you need to put in place in order to start the project.
Yeah, thank you. Comma works quite differently to a lot of other publishing houses that concentrate on novels. Comma obviously specializes in short stories, so we work through we produce a lot of anthologies, and we find a lot of our writers through those anthologies that we then work with on single author collections. So it's additionally sort of complicated for us. I'd say there's quite a few things you need to put in place. One, as Antony rightly started with, the cost of translation is often more than the licensing fee or the author's fee that you'll pay for the English language rights. So you have to sort of build that into your business model or your budgets for the project. And because of that, you have to be very, very familiar with the different funding opportunities there are for you. It doesn't necessarily mean that you can't do it if you don't have the translation costs covered, but it really does kind of limit what you can do if you can't get those covered. So first of all, you need to kind of be very, very familiar with the sort of funding pots and grants and projects schemes that are out there to support you, and that could be anything from the ministries of culture within the countries themselves that have like a translation grant scheme. Lots of different countries have different ways of supporting their writers and getting their writers into other languages. So, for instance, Catalan has the Ramon Lull Foundation, and Germany has the Goethe Institute. Spanish has Instituto Cervantes. Sweden has the Swedish Arts Council, I think. Norway has a thing called Norla. Turkey has a scheme called TEDA, TEDA, I think, or it used to. So there's lots and lots of kind of bodies that you need to be familiar with, and often they're part of the Ministry of Culture of those countries. And and a great way of researching that is going to the London Book Fair and looking at this and talking to the people that are promoting those literatures. That limits you, however, to those countries that have got those schemes, and that can be quite problematic. It's often European languages that have that kind of support. Non-European languages often don't. And then you have to look at other opportunities. One of those, a regular one that Common is always eternally grateful for, is English Pen. But there are other sort of ways of drawing in money, like British Council has some schemes which might be appropriate. They're not really built for this exactly, but you might be able to interpret their submission guidelines in a way that would support your project. And there are lots of others, but it's always the first thing you think about. How do I get over that first hurdle of this additional payment for the translation costs? Sometimes you might work with another publisher to bring out a co-edition, like another publisher in another country, and in that case you can split the costs, or you can, if you're very confident, you can say this project is going to sell to other English language publishers around the world, and you can build an expected sale of rights into your overall costing of the project. So we've been very lucky. We've been able to sell like North American rights, for instance, to a number of our books, and that's offset some of the translation costs. So there's lots of ways of doing it, but that's the first thing you need to think about, and you need to solve it before we can move forward, really. The next thing you need to do is kind of really embed yourself in the networks of translators from a particular language out there, and get to know who those translators are. And it'll range obviously from people who are extremely established translators who have been around for years and have won every award available, through to emerging translators who are very enthusiastic and kind of just breaking into the industry. There are lots of sort of networks out there which are supporting translators of particular languages, or networks that are supporting young emerging translators in that kind of support each other. So, for instance, with Chinese, there's a network called the Paper Republic, which is like a group of Chinese translators who kind of review what they do and support each other. And then there's other kind of small groupings of translators. There's the Emerging Translators Network, I think it's called. There's other little alliances, like I think called the Starling Bureau. And yeah, there's just lots of kind of groupings of translators. And once you start to work in one particular language, you realize there's lots of others. So you need to be familiar with them and kind of connect with them and network them. And again, London Book Fair is good for that. Also, there's International Translation Day, which I think is the 30th of September. There's usually some events around that. In Manchester, we have a thing called Manchester in Translation, which is a kind of workshop series in February, which is around the February the 21st every year. So these kind of places are really good ways of, these events are good ways of kind of getting to know those translators. You also need to kind of continually be exposed to the new writing coming through in certain areas, and you need to kind of consider how you do that. So if you're specializing in one particular language, then that's pretty straightforward, because you'll have already built and chosen your kind of specialism, your expertise in that, and you'll probably have your own ways of engaging with that culture regularly. But for us as short story writers, we found it very short story publishers, sorry, we found it very useful to go to certain festivals or certain events. So for years, myself and my colleague Jim Hinks used to go to a festival in Croatia called the European Festival, the Festival of European Short Story, which brought together short story writers from across Europe and across the world, really. And it was very helpful. We found so many writers there, which we went on to publish. Sometimes we went straight into publishing full collections by them. So that was really, really useful. But the biggest question for us, because we do anthologies, is also finding the right editor. And sometimes, and that editor needs to have the right relationship with the writers that you're hoping to work with. So sometimes the editors of anthologies can be, they might be journalists, they might be publishers, they might be writers themselves, they might be translators. They could be, we've worked with all different kinds of writers, editors, but they need to have a very, very strong link and with the sort of writing community in that country or that city that we're translating from, and that sometimes is a relationship that takes many years to get right. I think we've researched the right editor for a certain book up for like 3 years until we found the right editor. And if you get the right editor to work with, sort of co-editor, if you like, everything pretty much clicks into place in terms of your relationships with the writing community. It's also good to have a second reader, so it's not just you who maybe doesn't speak the language and an editor sort of talking at cross purposes, or not quite being able to communicate directly or understand each other in terms of exactly when you're discussing potential texts. You'll only have like a reader's report or a synopsis, and sometimes that's not enough to go on. Obviously, it's not enough to go on. So sometimes it's good to have a second reader in that conversation to help you kind of understand the non-objective kind of elements of a text without just translating it first. So yeah, there's a lot of preparation to do.
Yeah, and getting a real sense of that there's a sense of community when you're building a translation project. You have to understand the people, the culture, the text, the style of the writer. As Antony was saying, bringing people over, if that's an important part of your marketing plan, how do you do that? I think you do have to be very good at planning, very good at connecting, finding the right language for something. So I think these are all really useful things to know up front. I wondered for you, Nadia, so obviously English Pen, you have many different funding streams, so I'm sure you'll have a lot to say on this. However, what kind of funding opportunities are there available with yourselves? And also, how do you think publishers can best position themselves to access that funding?
Thank you. Yeah, so like you said, we have 2 main grants that we distribute for translation. One of them is Pen Translates, which is a grant that we award to help UK publishers meet the cost of translating new works into English, and that can be from any language or any genre and any format, although we don't do magazines, but we do anthologies, non-fiction and all that. And we do that so we can ensure that translators are paid properly, and also that the work that can be brought into English is that of takes great care in actually bringing work that is going to build the bibliodiversity of the UK publishing scene. So that's was one part. The other part is Pen Presents, which is funds the often unpaid labour of translating, doing translations of samples from translators, and so it allows them to create a sample that they can be pitched to a publisher, and they can potentially get work from that. And we've seen a really interesting merging of those 2 pots of grant funding, and how UK publishers are now trying to interact with translators who want to bring projects that aren't necessarily seen as viable in the market at the minute. But in terms of publisher specific, I mean, Ra did a great job of listing all those different state funding spaces that you can go to, and we do see, I can kind of speak into that. Most of those pots are mainly European languages, and a lot of languages outside of that don't necessarily have the kind of same format of state funding. And it's why we see less risk being taken by UK publishers in terms of what they're publishing, because there's kind of less space for funding to be received to fund that often quite expensive work of translation. In terms of best positioning, depending on kind of your experience and how much you know of your the language in which you're trying to translate from. We really value publishers who have done that groundwork that Ra and Antony were talking about, looking into the market, looking into the outreach groups that you'd want to look be bringing the book to, and also thinking about when you're acquiring the project, what that will look like and how it fits into your wider portfolio as well as the UK scene. In one of the kind of pitfall, I think this is the kind of question from later, but one of the things that we really look out for is how much care you're taking in the sensitivity around a project. We've had some kind of varying levels of what's the right word? Yeah, the applications are varying, that's all I'll say. Some publishers value the funding more than others. We see indie presses taking more care with that because the operations are slightly different. But we see that the best projects are the ones that actually consider the wider context in which they're speaking into, rather than just like, this project needs funding, it'll look great for our portfolio, and actually understanding how they can best improve the experience of the writer and the author and the translator and everybody involved. Yeah, it's very easy to tell when an application has been done in a rush and what has been actually taken care with. But because we're seeing more applications coming in and smaller amounts being awarded, we're really looking for exceptional work. And unfortunately, when there's a high standard with all of them, not every project gets awarded. But to kind of position yourself in the best way possible, it's taking that care and really showing that through the application writing as well.
Yeah, we will come back and ask you more about the common pitfalls that you're seeing diplomatically. So yeah, it's great to hear that, and it's interesting to think about, as you say, the portfolio of the translator and of the writer as well. I think that perhaps when we approach a funding application, we don't consider that because we're thinking, well, I'm applying as a publisher for our list, you know, so it's good to have that in mind. I wondered, Antony, you talked a little bit about this earlier with the disputes that you had when the translation went over a certain length. So I wondered, how do you balance staying true to the original text whilst also making it accessible to a new linguistic and cultural audience?
Yeah, so I think in regards to when a text comes that is longer than you expected, perhaps it's a few thousand words or several thousand words more than you had predicted. As a publisher of translated fiction, you don't really have an option of like trimming that amount. So you really do have to, in that sense, you have to stick to the original. You have to stay true to the original text. Maybe 9 times out of 10, you're going to have to stick to the original length, and you can't go trimming chapters or anything. But generally, that's not a common issue or a common problem, and it's more common for the as you say, there is a balancing act of, on one hand, it's the original staying true to the original text, and then it's also trying to make this text accessible to the new readership, which is English readers of English. And to be honest, for this we do rely on the translator. So we have to be confident that we've hired a competent translator that can sort of incorporate this balancing act into their act of translation. And that's mostly because even if we could read the original language of every book that we publish, it's just not feasible to compare line by line the translation with the original text. So we do have to trust the translator, and yeah, I mean, we've been lucky by working with great translators that have never let us down. But when it comes to the editorial stages, there can be like words or phrases or even sections of like text that we don't understand the cultural background to this passage, or there could be certain terms that we are concerned that are we making it inaccessible by not explaining this term or this phrase. And if that's the case, then we will just have a conversation with the translator. We will just say what we're thinking, and we'll have a small conversation. And I think maybe 70% of the time, the translator says, yeah, that's a good point, I'll make the change. And maybe 30% of the time, the translator says, no, I think I'd like to stay with this this original language that I used for these reasons. And then quite often we see their point of view and we think, yeah, okay, that's a good point, let's just leave it. So I think so I think for us, we rely on the translator, and it is really about working together with the translator and having conversations about anything that we have any sort of concerns about, really. So
yeah, it's interesting, this idea of trust, isn't it? Like, you have to find the right person, like you say, and then you can trust that they're making the best decisions for you. And it seems like collaboration is a big part of publishing. So I wanted to ask, we talked a little bit about publisher and translator relationships, and I wanted to ask Ra what role collaboration between translators and authors plays in that process, and how do you as a publisher facilitate that, if you do? Or does the author and the translator, do they talk about that process?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it varies wildly from one case to another. You often get translators who are very proactive in kind of supporting and developing and kind of platforming writing from a particular language, and they're effectively like activists for that particular literary culture. And there are certain people who are absolutely sort of integral for publishers to talk to and to get to know. And often you'll also get translators who find themselves working with a particular writer that they have a kind of an affinity with, and they get on with, and you find them trying to nurture that relationship later, sort of in an ongoing kind of way. And so writers sometimes get attached to translators, and that's a really, really healthy thing to do. And whenever I'm putting together or allocating writers with translators on anthology projects, I often find that I need to preserve relationships that are already existing. So if a translator's already, from my list, has already worked with one of the writers, I sort of keep that going. But sometimes I will be the one as a publisher who's found the writer completely independently, and I'll just suggest them to a translator. But sometimes there'll already be existing relationships there, and it's a tricky one because it's a balancing act, really, from a translator's point of view, how much they should get involved in pushing a particular writer to publishing houses, and it really depends on that translator's relationship with that publishing house. If they work with them on a regular basis, they know that their opinions will be highly respected and taken on board. But if they're kind of if they've never worked with that publisher before, pitching an author to be translated by that publishing house for the first time is pretty much like an on-spec author pitch, and publishers don't really take those kind of pitches too seriously, as I say, unless they've already got a relationship with their translator. So it's a tricky balancing act. Publishers, so like an English publisher and a French publisher, we want to talk to each other about the book, about if one is trying to sell the other to the other, they'll want to talk about the kind of the sales and how it was framed, how it was pitched, where it was pitched within the market, and things like that. And they'll want a publisher to publisher conversation. And often, rights deals are between publishers most of the time, or publishers and agents. And translators don't really have a particularly strong position within those types of conversations to pitch new writers. So it's to completely new publishing houses. So it's all about the translator's relationship, building that relationship with the publisher, and staying close with the writers that they've translated in the past. So sometimes from Common's point of view, it's sometimes really easy, because we often work with we'll work with a co-editor who'll edit an entire collection, and they'll be a translator themselves. And then that's really great, because then they can start kind of advocating for writers that they support. But it's not always, it's very different, I guess, with novel publishing. And it's usually the deal that's done first between two publishers, or between a publisher and an agent. And then the translator is brought on as a secondary kind of consideration. So yeah, it varies.
It's great to hear that some translators and writers stay together for life, if you like, and represent their life's work. I think that's really positive, because then they deeply understand the text and the author's style, and builds in this trust, as Antony was saying earlier. So I wondered, and this may not be one for everyone, so don't feel that if you don't have anything on that you have to answer. However, I wondered how you currently see the market evolving for translated literature in recent years, from your own perspective. And perhaps if you have any expected trends that you foresee to see in future, that would be really interesting to hear about. Perhaps we start with Nadia, because you were saying earlier that there were some languages perhaps, or projects, which were not currently viable for publishers, which suggests you might have an idea of what is currently evolving and not.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, because so I've worked on this. I've worked at English Pen for about 4 years, and in that time I've seen like a real shift in what's being brought into the kind of the grant pools and whatnot. And we see a lot more shorter titles coming through, rather than those long kind of hefty novels, which is understandable given the translation costs, but also paper costs and kind of pitching those big titles. And I think there's less risk involved in poetry and those anthologies that are coming through, because you can collect a lot of different writers together, and you can kind of dip that person's toes into the kind of the UK market. So we're seeing shorter form coming through. What has been really interesting actually is that we're seeing a shift from the Eurocentric languages to kind of more global majority. So we've had more languages coming from the African continent recently, which has been really exciting to see. We've seen quite a few Southeast Asian titles coming through as well, after the especially from India, given the success of Tomb of Sands with Gitanjali Sri. So I feel like that's what I hope to see continuing, actually, kind of those global majority languages coming through. And yeah, I hope that publishers will take a couple more risks as well in terms of that too, because I think that the market is so saturated with European languages at the minute that it's an easy way to kind of promote, given that they're easy to get to the UK and there's already an existing market. But there are so many communities that are just crying out to read books from the languages from different parts of the world. And we're seeing that through kind of the successes online as well, in terms of social media and whatnot. So yeah, I think that's kind of my only kind of suggestions.
I love that. That's really interesting, Nadia. It would be great if we had more diversity and options for people, as you say, from every community. So it's brilliant to hear that different languages from the global majority are coming in. I wondered, Antony or Ra, do you have any kind of, what have you seen changing in translated literature over the last few years?
Yeah, I think one thing we've definitely noticed since we started publishing several years ago is that there's been a huge boom in the popularity of Korean literature. So when we started, we would publish, maybe in 1 year, we'd publish about 3 or 4 books of Korean fiction. And as a proportion of the works translated into English from Korean writers, the books we were publishing was like a huge proportion of the entire number of books, if that makes sense. Like, so say only 10 books of Korean writers were translated that year, and if we published 3, that was like a huge percent published by Honford Star. But fast forward a few more years, and now it's just dozens and dozens of Korean books being published, and I think it's definitely a trend. It's I don't know how long it's going to continue to grow at this rate, but it's definitely been really helpful for us, and it's been something we've really welcomed as a publisher, because we do most of our books are Korean fiction actually. So yeah.
I was going to say, are you worried about the trend changing, as many things in publishing do? But it sounds like you would continue to publish Korean translation because that's the bulk of your catalogue, right?
Yeah, that's right. I think me and my fellow co-founder, we have links to Korea, so that's why most of our books are from Korea.
Wonderful. Thank you, Antony. You don't have to answer, Ra, but if you have a
Yeah, no,
I
I would just second what Nadia and Antony said. I think Korea is a big thing. A few years ago, like 10, 15 years ago, Scandinavia was the thing, and I think Korea is the hot sort of kind of country at the moment, the hot culture. So yeah, and it's just to repeat what Nadia was saying, there's been a general kind of move away from European languages and European texts, which has been fantastic because it kind of dominated everything within the translation sphere until recently.
Brilliant. Now this is sounding really positive. I guess at the start of the the talk we were perhaps talking about time, money, investment, planning, and now we're talking about positives and readers and why we do it, which is gorgeous to hear about. I wanted, Nadia, obviously we talked earlier about some pitfalls. You may have some more that you currently see. So common pitfalls in translation projects when someone's applying to you. How can publishers avoid them? If they've never done a translation project before and they're not too sure what to put in a grant letter, what things should they avoid?
Yeah, it's I kind of just from the panels that I've observed, I kind of categorize it into kind of 3 areas. So for me, one of the big ones is the risk that a publisher takes. So you can have a specialism, but what are you doing that's slightly different to that specialism? How is this title in particular contributing to the UK market? And in what way are you championing a new writer or an existing writer in a different way? So we see a lot of people we've had applications in the past where people are like, oh yeah, it's just a new writer. No, it's never existed in the market before. They're like this person and that's it. It's like, but what are you doing to support that person in this space? How are you taking that risk? And yeah, and that kind of speaks into one of the other kind of factors that always comes up is sensitivity. So there's a lot of amazing work being done where a lot of publishers are now reaching out to young LGBTQ writers from different countries, but they're not doing the work that would provide kind of safeguarding if they were to be published here, or what that would look like for them in their kind of original context. So it's about not just publishing for the clout, but actually publishing because you believe that this is work that you want to champion, and kind of displaying how best you're positioned to be able to be the right publisher for that writer or translator. And the most common thing that comes up in terms of pitfalls is marketing and outreach. There are so many. Often I've read a really good application and it's like this publisher clearly knows the project, they're really championing it, they really want to do well, but there's absolutely no thought into the marketing of it or the outreach and how they're going to look out beyond the existing market. It's just really disappointing, and it's often why a lot of the panelists get turned off a project, because they're like, I don't have any faith that this publisher, despite their brilliance in terms of wanting to bring this title into English, don't actually know how they're going to market it. So how will it do well? So what we want to see is you looking beyond the traditional spaces. Like one thing I will say is, if you're going to say you're going to reach out to a bookshop, make sure you actually have already reached out to them, because there's been times where we've had a bookseller who's like, they've never reached out to me about this, but they said in their application that they're going to reach out. So please do your due diligence and make sure that what you're saying is actually something that you're backing up and is existing work. So yeah, being very thorough. We can definitely read when an application has been just done by an editorial assistant who doesn't know anything about this application process. We can sense the thought and care, and I think making sure that you are thorough in every part of the application as well. Please don't leave your marketing and outreach plans to be sparse. It really reads badly on the panel. So yeah, that's kind of my advice.
Is there, because I've not seen this form before, Nadia, is there specifically a question that asks about marketing? Is that why people are leaving it off, or is there's a question there for them to answer and it's just not fully developed?
Yeah, I mean, Antony and Raoul have done many of these, but there's a huge section, so it's about 4 or 5 questions, and we ask about different communities, existing communities, how you'll kind of promote the writer, lots of promotional and marketing and outreach questions that we have in there, and it's just because we want to know that whatever title we support has a good chance of doing well in an already saturated market of translation. Like, I always find this fact quite interesting, but translation is the fastest growing kind of genre of fiction, whatnot, in the UK, and that most of those readers are young people. Like a third of all kind of translation readers are under the age of 35, which I think is, but a lot of the marketing and outreach plans aren't talking about Bookstagram, or they're not talking about places where young people are convening or talking. They're just kind of going, oh, we'll pitch the LRB, or we'll do an event with this big bookshop somewhere. But it's like, you're not thinking about the wider market. We need to know that you understand the market in which you're pitching into. So not to say that's the only space that you should be speaking about, but we want to see a well-rounded understanding.
Yeah, that's good to know as well, because I think some people might potentially think that, you know, on a funding application, saying something like naming book talkers might alienate, or, you know, might cause some, I don't know, snobbery from the judging panel, or not be seen as valid. But to know that the bulk of readers reading and translation are under 35 is quite significant. You would go to Instagram, TikTok, you know, you would go to spaces that the young people are. So I think that's really valuable to know. Thank you. We have just under 15 minutes. So if you do have any audience questions, pop them in the chat or raise your hand. Oh, great. There's already some coming through on for me. But I will just ask one last question while people are typing from the audience. And not everyone has to answer this, but Nadia's touched on it a little bit here, so I think it's really useful to continue that conversation. What kind of strategies do we currently employ to promote translated works effectively in a new market? So whether we've translated them into English in this case.
Yeah, I can try and answer that. So I think one thing that we try and do at Honford Star is we try and lean into the fact that it's a translation, and we kind of treat that, and as Nadia mentioned, there's the increase in the popularity of translated fiction, and so we try and make it clear that it's a translated book. We put the translator's name on the front cover, and we hire book designers from Korea, Japan, and China, and we think that one of the benefits of doing that is that the design language that these designers use is different from UK or US book designers, and the result is that our books, we hope our books look a little bit different and interesting, and not like the British or American fiction titles that they're sitting next to on the bookshop shelves. So that's something we try to do, is try to lean into the fact it's a translation and try and promote the fact that it isn't a English or American author.
I like that. And I think people do like to celebrate difference. And as Nadia was saying, seek out those communities. So by having the translator on the front, you know, the translator's names, everything is very important, I think. And having the designer from that country just sort of speaks to that sensitivity that we've all been speaking about. So yeah, that sounds excellent. Thank you for sharing that. I've got a question from Jersey in the chat, and you know, anyone would be able to answer this one. So what would be the most innovative marketing and outreach ideas for translation projects, which you've seen or perhaps used, which circumvent some of the costs of flying out the authors for promotional activities? Perhaps there are some marketing strategies which are specific to literature and translation.
I guess I can speak into that a little bit. In terms of kind of promotion and whatnot, we know a lot of publishers now have like climate policies where they're not flying people out, but giving a suggestion of festivals that you're going to reach out to, if there's any local diaspora groups in the UK that you know of who you're going to be speaking with, or maybe doing like a panel with. Also bearing in mind, don't be too extractive with this. Like we get that, you know, it's easy to kind of say, oh, we'll reach out here, there, but actually building a community. So it could, we've had marketing plans where people have said they're going to do a book club collaboration with a local group who are specifically for X community. And I think that those sorts of innovative ideas are really, really exciting. Yeah, they might not be but we also bear in mind that marketing and outreach plans these are done before the actual book is published, and as in like before the book is kind of fully translated. And so, but we want you to kind of think around, give us ideas of what you're thinking and how you're being innovative out of the box. So yeah, less traditional spaces, more local community groups, because what we want to do is champion reading for everyone rather than just the kind of the literary elite and whatnot. Because we do get that a lot from the kind of the bigger publishers out there who don't really do that groundwork in the way that indies do. So yeah, local groups I think is great. Online panels like this one are great when we see them coming through, because we understand that these are ways to mitigate the kind of promotional costs, but also you're still getting out to people and still being able to promote the book and promote the writer and translator in the market as well.
Brilliant. That was really helpful and insightful. Cheers, Nadia. And maybe then, Ra, to end on, do you use, so obviously at Comma Press, there's this Reading the City series, and I believe there's more than 27 titles now which travel the city and kind of literary story, with 10 stories and translators of short fiction. So maybe you could talk about innovative marketing strategies that you use for that series, because I know that a lot of the marketing goes across, and perhaps there might be similar strategies that you're using across that series in terms of the marketing.
Yeah, we've kind of explored loads of different things. Really, we had an iPhone app and an Android app called LitNav at one point, which actually used app technology to kind of allow you to visit a city and listen to an audio version of the story, or toggle between that and a text version, whilst also kind of moving through a virtual version of that city using Google Maps and other kind of devices. So we've done everything from that through to kind of just encouraging people to engage with the text and the physical space. So we've had writers kind of read extracts of their stories from different parts of the city, and kind of name checking the city as they read it. And we've had that sort of made available through YouTube and other kind of platforms and SoundCloud. So there's lots of sort of digital things you can do. They're kind of quite time consuming, and sometimes they're a little bit sort of event specific. But the kind of, for me, the challenge with translated fiction is often just accepting the fact that the writers won't be household names, and then connecting, but trying to connect them to the readers through other kind of bridges of familiarity or interest. So when we do, a lot of our anthologies are like kind of Venn diagrams of different interest groups. So there'll be people who are interested in the city, the people who are interested in the language, people who are interested in the region generally, the politics or the history of that region, the culture of that region. There'll be people who are interested in the short story. There might be some genre kind of interest groups. So it's all about bringing those together, whether you bring them together in at events or through events or through marketing, kind of other marketing means. So yeah, it's all, we always do it on a case-by-case basis, but people are always interested in the city itself, whether it's a destination for for kind of from a tourist point of view, or if they've got a connection through with the city, they've lived there, or they may have family from there, etc., or they're interested in the politics of that city. There's always entry points into that text, and that's why we've sort of devised that series. And likewise, we have another series which explores science fiction or futurism, and it's a great way, a genre is a great way of bringing writers into an unfamiliar territory, because their love of the genre will take them anywhere. Just like I mentioned Scandinavian writing earlier. Scandinoir was a case of just people who love crime writing and thriller writing. That genre love took them to Scandinavian and sort of embedded them in those new writers and those new cultures. And it's the same with science fiction or horror writing. Readers are always looking for new contexts and new variations and new iterations of the genres that they love. So it's about building on those really, and getting that work into those new spaces, new kind of readership spaces.
Thanks, Ra. I mean, that really speaks to finding a mutual language, and it's a lovely way to end it, actually. And you have to back that up. I've been hearing a lot about Filipino noir, for example, and Filipino Gothic, and I think it is interesting to find an international slant on something which we may have already read within that genre. Last but not least, we could probably squeeze this one in from Jersey. You may not have access to this, guys, but you may know off the top of your head. Are there any sales stats on translated literature? So probably you'd only be able to speak to your own books, but perhaps Nadia has some idea of the market. And what would be considered a good realistic initial print run when you're applying for funding? Might be a bit of a tough one.
I can't speak into the sales side of things because we don't kind of follow that post awarding the grant, but what I can say to the print run, we're seeing a lot of an increase in people saying print on demand, which is very vague and actually makes the panel a little bit uneasy. And whilst we know that's kind of something that people are moving towards just because of environmental factors, giving a rough indication of how many books you hope to publish is actually a really important thing in terms of grant funding. A good amount is, depending on the size of the publisher, I guess 500 to 1,000 books. Bigger publishers do much larger amounts, but predominantly we get around 1,000 copies per print run, and that seems to be that the baseline for most publishers to kind of to put on their applications. But please always put a print run, because it's very uncertain for the panel as to what they're awarding and how they're awarding if they're not sure of your kind of your additional costs, I guess.
Thanks, Nadia. I think we'll end it there, but this has been super useful and very informative, and hopefully uplifting for people that are about to approach a translation project, and gives you a little bit of an idea about how to approach that infrastructure, where to find people. Thank you so much to all the panelists for your information. This has been recorded, so I will send it around afterwards for you, and I hope you have a gorgeous rest of the day, and hopefully see you in the afternoon. 2 p.m. we have How to Sell Rights to TV and Film. We'll see you there.